Let me tell you a little bit about Woody. He runs the Green Hills Music Group, which is described as a uniquely independent publishing house. He's an MTSU grad and also an inductee into our Wall of Fame, which you may have noticed. You may have seen Woody's picture over there. He left a successful advertising career to follow a passion in music, starting as a songwriter for Combine Music Publishing. Woody penned hits for Loretta Lynn, Conway, Twitty, Hank Williams Jr., Lee Greenwood, Lynn Anderson, T.G. Sheppard, and others. He promoted the music of writers, staff writers, including Kris Kristofferson, Tony Joe White, Larry Gatlin, Dolly Parton. Pretty darned impressive list. From there, he moved to Little Big Town and was an executive there, which went on to celebrate 15 #1 hits, 30 top 10 singles, and more than 500 major label cuts during a 10-year period, with songs recorded by Faith Hill, George Strait, Tim McGraw, Reba McEntire, Diamond Rio, Kenny Chesney, Waylon Jennings, Vince Gill, Patty Loveless, and not just country, but also some pop and Americana stars, Neil Diamond, Delbert McClinton, Dusty Springfield, Peter Frampton. This is a really impressive list of names. Little Big Town was then bought by Sony ATV, and Woody served as Senior Vice President of Sony ATV for a number of years, but in 2007 he wanted to return back to an independent setting, so he launched his own Green Hills Music Group. Woody's a member of the Country Music Association, the Americana Music Association, Leadership Music, the Songwriters Guild of America, the Academy of Country Music, ASCAP, the Recording Academy, Belmont University's Entertainment Industry Advisory Board, the Musicians Hall of Fame Advisory Board, and that is an abridged list of his affiliations. He's a 2-time recipient of the Nashville Songwriters Association President's Award, but most importantly, a member of the MTSU Wall of Fame. So please welcome Woody Bomar.
Well, that's my career story. We can go right to Q&A.
All right. He did miss Nashville Public Library on your affiliations. That's one of those. Let me say this. I never will forget.
We have something to prop that door open just a little bit. Thanks.
So I never will forget when I was close to your guys' age, one of the first big experiences I had as a songwriter was riding with my buddy Jay at Little Big Town and getting to go into Woody Bomar's office and getting him to critique a song we had written the last week, hoping that he would let us demo it. And no, you told us what was wrong with it. And we went back to the drawing board, and it was exactly what we needed to do. And but it was a big thrill for me because I knew Woody's reputation as a writer and a publisher, and also all the writers that he had nurtured and brought up. The first thing I want to ask Woody is, because I know this is on our students' mind, is how did you make the transition out of MTSU into the music biz?
When I graduated MTSU, it was during the Vietnam War, and so once I graduated, I lost my student deferment from the military, took a job selling airtime at a radio station in Franklin, Tennessee for literally a few weeks, and I got my draft notice, went into the Army, went in the Army for 2 years, first year at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, the hardest year. The second year was in Vietnam. And after that, I moved to Nashville. I'm from Middle Tennessee, a small town here in Middle Tennessee originally, but I moved to Nashville with dreams of getting into the music business as a writer and an interest in publishing, and I didn't really connect, and I wound up taking a job as a copywriter at an advertising agency. I was there for 10 years, we'll just really fast forward through that, and in that 10 years, I was executive vice president of Nashville's oldest advertising agency, and I resigned to become an out-of-work songwriter. And I was successful at being an out-of-work songwriter for about 18 months, and I got a job at Combine Music, which was an independent music company, a very successful, now legendary independent music publishing company. so that's pretty much the transition. I mean, in terms of, at the advertising agency, I was doing very well financially, but I just had this nagging feeling inside that that wasn't what I was meant to do, and I got more and more unhappy in that. And at some point, I just couldn't stand not to quit anymore, financial reasons aside. And I had a wife and a small child. Still have the wife. The child is not small now. But anyway, that's kind of the transition period there.
And for you guys that don't know, combine music is legendary. That's where people like Kris Kristofferson. Tell us all who wrote there when you.
Well, when I was there, now I was writing there, and a good friend that I wrote with, who was also a song plugger there, died very suddenly. And his name was Johnny Wilson, and it was with Johnny that I had my first real cut, which was a Loretta Lynn single. And we wrote several songs together, and then he died very suddenly one night of just a sudden heart attack with no illness or anything. So after about 6 months, the boss decided that they needed someone to fill that slot, and he needed someone particularly to plug the Kris Kristofferson and Tony Joe White catalogs. And so he hired me to do that. And Tony Joe White, you probably know the name Kristofferson. I don't know if you know Tony Joe, but he had two huge hits. One was called Polka Salad Annie, that you might have heard on Oldies radio if you ever listened to that. And the other one was a song called Rainy Night in Georgia, both of which he wrote in the same week, I think. But anyway, as an artist, but since then he's had a lot of cuts by, like, I think the Pointer Sisters and, I don't know if you know who that is. I'm a little hesitant to mention some names because I don't know if you have a clue who they are. Just like you could mention some names that I wouldn't have a clue who they are. But what was the question?
Well, just about combine, and I don't know that they know how legendary it is. So
yeah, when I was writing there, it was like from, I think, 60, I guess it would have been, mainly during the late 70s, late 70s and early 80s. And other writers that were there, a guy named Pat McManus. I can name names that wouldn't mean anything to you because they're not artists. Because the artists are the ones that get all the fame, and the songwriters who are not artists, they come, they write a lot of hits, and if they're not artists, they're usually not remembered for generations like the artists are. But there was a guy named Bob Morrison who was ASCAP Country Songwriter of the Year for 4 out of 5 years in a row. Thomas Kane, Bob DePiro, who later was with me at Little Big Town Music when we started, my partner and I started Little Big Town Music. Bob DePiro and John Scott Sherrill, who were both combine writers, went with us when we started our new company. So I guess Larry Gatlin, of course, as an artist, writer. Kristofferson, by then, I met Kris a few times, but I didn't have a close relationship. He had moved off to LA and become a media star by the time I started working his catalog. And also his catalog had been picked over for 12 years. So that sounds like a dream job, plugging Kris Kristofferson songs, but they had been picked over for a long time. But I did get a few cuts. But soon after I got to the company, I was plugging for all the writers, in the company.
When you became a song plugger, how did that change your perspective on songwriting?
Well, it changed the perspective on my songwriting because I reached a point where I felt like I had to pretty much put that aside and to decide if I was going to be a writer or a publisher. Now, it works for some people to do both, but I could tell, I heard some rumblings that some of the other writers thought or assumed that I was taking advantage of my plugging sessions to plug my songs instead of theirs. It wasn't true. But, that would be a natural assumption for the other writers if I'm a writer and a song plugger. And I just felt like that wasn't working. I don't really feel like that I had the long-term talent and gifting that some people do that go on for several decades, and like Bobby Braddock and a few others who write, very successfully for several decades. I don't think I had that kind of gift. I think it was the right call for me. I think the publishing side was where I belonged.
And since you started out as a songwriter, how did that affect your work as an approach as a plugger and a publisher?
I think probably the best way is understanding the writer's mind and the writer's emotions, and realizing that as a songwriter, you always have self-doubt. Whenever you have a hit, it doesn't matter how many hits you've had, you always wonder, gosh, is this my last? Is it ever possible that I'll do this again? I mean, I mentioned, for example, a guy named Bob Morrison, who was ASCAP Writer of the Year 4 out of 5 years in a row, and he didn't have another cut for another 5 years, another important cut. So, you know, just understanding the writer, I think it makes you more sensitive in how to deal with a writer and how to approach them when you know personally the self-doubt, you know personally the phony arrogance that's really based on self-doubt. So I think just understanding how songwriters think and what they go through, that was very helpful for me in dealing with writers.
What all hats do you think a publisher plugger have to put on? I know some people have said they're counselors, they're salesmen.
Yeah, counselor, salesman, sometimes coffee maker, janitor, encouragers, I guess, you know, counselors might be in the counseling department, but just encouraging and reassuring writers that they're doing the right thing, being sure they do realize you're really working for them, that you're working to get those songs recorded. There was a lot more openness in recording projects to outside songs in those days, where the writers wrote, the pluggers plugged, the artists recorded, and the public bought records. There wasn't as much, in country music, there wasn't as, artists writing their own songs wasn't as prevalent. It was there with certain artist writers, like Larry Gatlin, we mentioned. Larry was only going to record what he wrote. But there were a lot more opportunities to pitch songs for recording projects that were open to other writers' songs and not just mainly the artist's songs.
Well, I know on a lot of the students' minds here, coming from somebody that's as seasoned as you and seen so many changes in the music business, what is it that you look for in young writers when you are meeting with young writers that are coming in? What are the qualities that you look for in young people that make you want to work with them, make you want to sign them?
Well, first and foremost, of course, is writing talent, is a gift for writing something that's a little different than what's on the radio. It's pretty hard for me to get cut songs like songs that are currently on the radio, because everybody's writing them, every company's pitching them, and the artists, again, for a large part, are co-writing them themselves. I look for just a good attitude, enthusiasm, passion for the music, writing music that is compelling. And that's such a vague term. What is compelling? What's compelling to me might not be to somebody else. But just something that shows an interesting perspective. We kind of have a history in the Nashville music community of bringing in new writers who have kind of a fresh, different approach or attitude to what their writing is. And so they came there writing alone in most cases because they didn't have people to co-write with. So then they come to town. This is kind of our history now. So then they come to town, we sign them and start networking them with other co-writers who are doing well, who are writing what's on the radio. And at some point, their songs very often become kind of just like everybody else's, and they tend to lose that special thing. I know when I was working with Tom Douglas at Sony ATV, Tom is a very successful writer, and he writes great songs by himself. And I just encouraged him to at least, and he didn't love co-writing either, and I said, at least one day a week, schedule time for yourself. Just to write one by yourself. And I think he's done that quite a bit. But certainly he got into the loop, as all of the really successful current writers do, of getting booked with artists. He writes with Lady Annie Bellum and several other artists and has had a lot of success, but those songs, for the most part, are just not as special as the one that come right from his heart. His first hit was a song called Little Rock, recorded by a guy named Colin Ray, who was on Sony Records, and it was just a very special, moving, emotional song. And I mean, Tom is a wonderful guy, still a good friend, and a wonderful writer, but those solo songs tend to be really kind of special.
Would you say today publishers are more interested in somebody that's networked into artist camps than they would somebody that can write a song by themselves?
I would say that would be a bonus. If you are networked into an artist camp that is already a successful artist, but with smaller independent companies like where I am now, unless you've got some pretty solid investors, you probably don't have the money to afford them once they've made that connection.
Right.
So that puts me working more with people who are trying to reach those connections and are really very talented and very active, but haven't really had any major success yet.
Mm-hmm.
Now I do work with a guy named Bob Regan, who's had quite a bit of success, Steve Williams, who's had quite a bit of success, Georgia Middleman, who has had some pretty big records. And those are people I've worked with since I started this company in, I think, 2007 or late 2006. But the other writers, the newer writers that I'm working with, because I don't have investor funding, I did have at the start, but when the market crashed in 2008, September of 2008, my investors just had to pull out. And since then, I'm just kind of operating on a shoestring in a sense. I mean, covering expenses, but honestly not making any big money or anything like that.
Let me ask you this. Another thing that I think is important to my songwriting students as they're going out to meet publishers and making the transition from Murfreesboro to Music Row, can you talk a little bit, because you've been the president of the New York Yankees in music publishing on Music Row, Sony. You ran Sony Publishing, that's the Yankees, and then you've done this cool boutique independent publishing company as well. Can you kind of share with them the pros and cons or the differences between the big corporate company and the small boutique publisher?
Well, it's easy to feel lost in the big corporate company. When I went to Sony ATV, so Sony bought my company, Little Big Town Music, in 98, and so I went to work there, and I'd never worked for a corporation before. I worked for Combine Music, which was a successful independent. Then I had my own company with a partner, Little Big Town Music. When you're independent and smaller, the writers get more individual attention. You can make quick decisions. If somebody calls and offers to pay only $200 for a song on the West Wing television show, you can decide to pass very quickly if you're not having to get corporate decision makers to make decisions. But things are just a lot more flexible. On the downside, you don't have the funding to do kind of whatever you really want to do that's good for the company. So the funding, having the Sony money, first of all as a salary, that was pretty sweet. But also just in terms of the deals that you do with writers and with artists. I mean, when I was at Sony ATV, I signed like Blake Shelton, Miranda Lambert, to writing deals, okay? Dierks Bentley, Taylor Swift at age 14, Rascal Flatts, Josh Turner, quite a few artist writers, in addition to full-time songwriters, but quite a few artist writers. In the smaller independent world, I don't have the luxury of being able to do that, you know. But I do have the luxury of being the owner and making all the decisions, but it's just a whole different financial level of operation, but it's a very gratifying level of operation. And fortunately, I've had the things I've had in the past which allow me to be able to to be in this kind of company right now.
Do you find there's more camaraderie between the writers and pluggers, or your smaller community than the big ones, or?
Actually, that probably is, it's a little bit the case at my company. Now, I've got like a couple of writers that write together a lot. I've got maybe 3 or 4 that write with each other, not all 4 at the same time, but because I'm a small independent, I have small office space, and I don't really have writers' rooms like I did when I had investors.
Right.
I had to give up some of the space, which is now rented out to other companies, but I did have writers' rooms, and there was a little bit more hanging out, but most of the hanging out is at their homes, or in a couple of cases, the writers have their own small office and studio where they do their demos. So in a sense, there may be a little more camaraderie that way. Now, when I went to Sony, I think the roster was about 150 writers, and one of my first jobs was to hone that down. I came in behind a predecessor who thought Sony's money was unending and signed all his friends and signed lots of people that, in my opinion, maybe should have not been signed to such big deals. But the music business was rocking in those days, and we're talking about through the mid-90s, you know, when these people were getting signed. And if you got a song on a Garth Brooks album, you know, you might sell 10 million the first month. I mean, now you don't make anything on an album cut because people don't buy albums, they buy singles. We're back to a singles business. But in those days, you could have a couple of good album cuts, and you could have a year, and you could have a career. I mean, it's just a whole different situation in those days. Greg mentioned that at Little Big Town, during our 10 years of operation, that we had 15 number ones. At the end of that 10 years, we did a little showcase and did compile a little CD compilation, and our theme was 10 years at the top. So we had this showcase with the writers singing their hits, and it was right after that Sony approached us and wanted to buy the catalog and hire me to run the creative department. So we did, sorry to step off camera, I know you're recording this, but we did this 3 CD compilation. We've got 2 CDs of hits, and then the 3rd CD is called Cool Cuts, and it's just things, as he also mentioned, like a Neil Diamond cut, a Dusty Springfield cut, Delbert McClinton, Chet Atkins, things that were not hit singles, but were for an independent company were just a pretty big deal at the time. So I brought this as a door prize because I always like to have door prizes when I speak somewhere. And I just made a decision that on the back row, the fourth person from the left was going to get this. So I think that's you. And then the fellow on the far back came in a little bit later, but you were the back row and when we started. And so, let me get this.
Sure.
I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you.
It's now it was a promotion piece, now it's a collector's item. That was in 1997 that we produced that, I think.
It's really great. I happen to have a copy thanks to Woody.
Great.
I was telling somebody the other day that back during that time in, say, the mid-90s, you could pretty much go to a gold, platinum, or #1 party every night of the week if you wanted to. That's how crazy it was. Money was flowing like wine.
And this is what's really crazy. When I was at Sony, I got to where I dreaded the #1 parties because it's a huge company and we had so many, and I was always the one presenting the award. And so I'd say, you know, how thrilled we are to have your name here among our writing staff and how great their catalog is and how wonderful this, you know, I'd kind of make the same speech maybe a couple of times a week, you know, and it's silly to even say that. I'm just being more honest than I probably should be by saying it, but that is an indication of how the business was doing. I mean, Nashville music business never thought it would have that kind of success. And there's reasons for it. You want to talk about that maybe just a little bit?
Absolutely.
It was at a time where, and I'm talking about the late 80s, early 90s, it was a time where white middle-class teenagers had like 2 choices. One was pretty much inner city music, and the other was country music. And kids started wearing cowboy hats and cowboy boots to school and learning line dancing. And it was just very popular among the kids. I refer to it as the pre-Hootie era. If you know the name Hootie and the Blowfish, they came along, and other bands from the Carolinas and quite a few from Seattle that gave the teenagers other choices other than country or inner city. And it pulled them away, and this huge boom in country music started unbooming. So I always say we were very blessed to start our company when we did, and we were very blessed to end it when we did.
And just let me say,
Little big town I'm talking about.
and let me say to you guys in the music business and that want to be publishers, when Woody's talking about selling his company, he basically reached the publishing pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. That's everybody's dream. You start a publishing company, you build up a catalog, and then you sell it off for $100 million. I'm just kidding. But you sell it off to sorry, Woody. But you sell it off to a major corporation, and then they hire you to run theirs too. That's the big, dream that you hope to get to do as an independent publisher, I would think.
And also, in the introduction, Greg said that after that 8 years, I chose to leave Sony ATV and go back into the independent world. I usually phrase it as they graduated me after 8 years, and then I started an independent company. I didn't necessarily choose to leave Sony. There was a regime change in New York, and they brought in new people, and they did not renew my contract. But I was fortunate to have that 8 years at Sony, and I was very pleased that 8 years was kind of the end of it. 8 years of corporate life for someone who's always been in the independent world can be a lot, but it was valuable. I learned how the corporates do business, and that sort of thing. And but it's good it's good that they graduated me. I can see it now, that I got back into the independent world.
I want to back up real quick and ask you, when you got to Sony and there was 150 writers, you pared it down to about 100, is that right?
I think about 75 or 80 by the end of the first year or two.
Wow. So what I wanted to ask you is, for these guys' knowledge, when you've got 75, 80 writers, how many new songs is your plugin team getting a week to absorb?
You mean a day?
Oh, a day. And maybe we should, how many written and then how many demoed,
We had a plugger meeting. I believe at the time I had either 4 or 5 other song pluggers that reported to me. We would meet in my office every morning at 9 o'clock to listen to the songs that came in the day before. And there were usually probably anywhere from a dozen to maybe 20 or so.
A day.
Yeah, half of them by Brett James. He's a writing machine. I don't know how he wrote so many songs. But, and then there were a lot by Odie Blackmon and Jim Lauderdale. Would you remember? Was it Lauderdale?
Yeah.
You were writing with, we got quite a few. I mean, they would kind of come in bunches because you'd write a bunch and then turn them in. But, I mean, the point is there were a lot of songs that came in, and there are 2 times that I can remember after those meetings actually just calling a writer to say, I love that new song. I mean, there were a lot of really good songs, but there was a song called 3 Wooden Crosses that Kim Williams, one of our writers, was a writer on. It turned out to be a big hit for Randy Travis, but when I first heard the demo, I called him and Doug Johnson, his co-writer, to compliment. Then there was another one that Casey Beathard wrote called Do You Want Fries With That? Tim McGraw wound up having a hit. But it was such a unique, interesting song. I guess that kind of goes to my point of something that is different, something that is interesting. Because, when you turn on country radio now, and it's all pickup trucks and cut-off jeans and red dirt roads and drink and shine and partying under the stars, I mean, that's kind of all you get. And you may know the term bro country that people call it now. But I believe we're going to see a turn this year in country music. And I think that we are starting to see a turn from all of that. And I believe also that we're going to start hearing more women on country radio. It is so bizarre that country radio basically has 2 big female stars, Carrie Underwood and Miranda Lambert. You know, there's some others that are coming along now, and I think we're going to see some big change there. And it's ironic that in pop music, it's all females. You know, Ariana Grande, Nicki Minaj, I mean, you know all the names. Katy Perry. I love Katy Perry's records, but I'm sure she uses the same drum track on every one.
It seems to be working.
It seems to be working quite well. But you know, it's so heavily dominated by female artists at the top on pop, at the top on country. It's all the guys. But I think for Sirius XM radio, my current country station is really promoting women hard and very openly and verbally, you know, like the Year of Women. They're really promoting that, and I think it's going to be helpful.
I'm really glad to hear you say that about songs sounding the same, because I think I have a lot of students that struggle with, and I remember this when I was young, a young writer, you struggle with, do I chase radio? Do I, you know, and you're sitting here saying that the people that write these bro countries that are hitting so much right now, they've kind of got that covered, and you're looking for somebody doing something different. Is that right?
Yes, very much so. And that's what gets my attention. You got to remember, it's incredibly competitive. I have a note on my website that says, I'm sorry, we're not currently accepting outside songs. That's really just part of the filtering process. People still sending me songs. And I usually listen to them. Are any of you country songwriters or interested in the country market? You know, when somebody sends me a song about pickup trucks and, you know, partying and drinking shine and all of those things that have become so trite to most of us in the industry, I don't pay a lot of attention. It may be well written, and I can listen to it and say, man, I can hear that on the radio today. That doesn't mean I can get it on the radio today. I can hear it on the radio, but there's a guy named Jim Ed Norman, who I believe is current president of Curb Records. He was head of Warner Brothers for years. But Jim Ed came in a few months ago and came into my office to listen to some new songs. And he said, if I wanted a party song or a drinking song or a honky-tonkin' song, he said, if I put the word out that that's what I was looking for an artist, I'd have 1,000 of them by Friday, and they'd all be good. So that's what I'm competing with if you're writing for current country radio. Now everybody's going gaga over Sam Hunt, and he doesn't do bro country as such. And I believe that all of the excitement about him is signaling a change to music with more substance, more emotion, just a change from that just subject matter that's just been absolutely beaten to death. I mean, there was a time when all the songs were about trucking, over-the-road truck drivers. And, you know, we went through a period of that, and everybody finally got sick of it, and we moved on. But I think that's kind of where we are right now, and Sam Hunt seems to be carrying the banner for that.
You know, what's interesting about Sam is that, who actually went to school here for a little while.
Oh, really? You flunk out?
I think he moved on up to Nashville.
Oh, did
And yeah, he got an investor down here, right in Columbia.
Oh.
But obviously the EDM type tracks are a big influence on Sam's music. He's kind of bringing that into country. And from what I'm understanding, everybody's jumping on that trend. The Eli Young Band's got a new single. They found it, they cut it, and they put it out in a 7-week period, which is crazy. And evidently they're saying the EDM tracks are going to be the new fad
Really?
from bro country. But that brings me to the question of the songwriter / track guy, or just the track guy that's getting songwriting deals now. How do you see that as far as, is the track thing a big deal, a big skill that most songwriters need now? How do you feel about that?
Most of those writers don't refer themselves as track guys, they refer themselves as songwriters. And we think of them as track guys because they're so good at creating those tracks. And I've got a writer that I work with, not a staff writer, but a writer who I have several songs from, who works with a couple of track writers. And they send the track, and she writes the melody and the lyrics pretty much to the track. But those songs wouldn't have happened without the track, and the track can just be so inspiring and invigorating to the creative juices that you just, you know, the co-writer starts hearing the song. And so, yeah, I mean, that is important. A lot of people are having success with it. I think most of the track writers, now the one I'm particularly thinking of right now, the writer that I work with lives in Boston. So the track writer sends the track there. But I think the track writers do enjoy getting into co-writing sessions as well. And now I've got a writer I work with named Rich Carg.
He graduated from the RAM program.
Yep, and Rich wrote for Universal Publishing for a while. He and his brother were a duo artist team and were on one of the TV shows, Can You Duet, I think was the name of that show. But anyway, Rich, I mean, every time he brings me a new demo, I'm just in awe of how he's developing the track skill just right there on his computer. Plays everything, you know? I didn't think he was that great of a musician, but boy, when you hear those tracks, and I just hear a subtle little guitar part, I'll say, now did you do that? He'll go, yeah, I did that. But he's really developing, and he's just one of probably many around the music community in Nashville who is just learning those skills so well. I mean, just the digital world that we now live in that I did not grow up in just gives you the tools to be able to just create fantastic sounds, you know. I mean, All About That Bass by Megan Trainor, I mean, it was just her and her producer in his studio. They did everything. And they took it to the record, and when she got her record deal, they just took the demo and mastered it as it was turned in as a demo, and put it out.
So for my songwriters, becoming a track person is a good idea, but if it's not your thing, being open to write with track people, definitely.
Absolutely. I've said ever since home recording became an option, I've said to writers, you know, if you know what you're doing and you can handle the technology and that's how you want to spend your time and are good at it, that's fine. But if you don't have a talent for that, you wind up wasting so much time reading manuals and then doing it, but not doing it as well as other people, you know, and you think, and I've got a writer who is doing that, and at some point I think I'm going to have to say to him, you know, you need to quit spending so much time doing it because you can do it, but your demos just don't have that sparkle and the musicianship and the great sound that some of these other writers do. I think we have a question if you want to.
Yes.
I was just going to ask, when your writers send you a song,
Mhm.
is it usually in a track format, or is it just like, you know, singer-songwriter type demo?
Usually the writers I work with will send me a writing room work version to start with.
Yeah.
But then at some point, a lot of them do get full demos, which they control the demo process and everything. But very often, most of the writers I work with will go ahead and send me a work version right after the writing session.
Will you pitch a well-recorded guitar vocal or piano vocal instead of full demo?
I've got a song that Bob Regan wrote with one of the most successful writers in town. I can't call his name right now. But he was NSAI Songwriter of the Year last year. I can't call his name, but I'd been pitching that song for about 1.5 years before I even realized it was a piano vocal. I mean, it was a gorgeous ballad, and I hadn't even noticed that it wasn't a full demo. I mean, it sounded great. So absolutely, if it doesn't need a full track, and if it's a one instrument and vocal, preferably with some vocal harmonies on the chorus, which helps a lot, absolutely. If there's no need for all the production. And a lot of songs don't need it, and some do. So I'm fine with a minimalist approach to just whatever it absolutely needs.
Can you share with everyone kind of the landscape of our of our business today, songwriting and publishing business, and how has it changed in the last few years? Where are we as far as making a living as a songwriter, making a living as a publisher, royalties, just the landscape? Where do you?
Well, the business has shrunk dramatically. I mean, I can remember in the heyday of the 90s that we talked about when there were probably 15 or 17 major record labels. Now there are 3. Some of those names still exist, but they've been absorbed by other corporate companies. So there's the Universal Group, which is Mercury and Capitol and EMI Nashville and MCA. You know, they've got a bunch of labels, but it's the Universal Group. There's the Warner Brothers Group, which includes Atlantic and Elektra and a couple of others, I think, Reprise, I guess. And then the Sony Group, which includes RCA, CBS, Columbia, B&A, Arista. So there are really 3 corporate companies to pitch songs to. You know, for all those labels, there used to be, all of those labels used to have their own company, their own office, their own A&R people that publishers and writers could go meet with and play the new songs for them. But now it's so competitive and that you don't do as many in person. I don't have people coming into my office to sit and listen to a lot of songs that much anymore, because now the technology, it's just so easy to just email an MP3 file. So a lot of it is just more single song pitching in that way, instead of going to meet in their office. Now if you go and meet in their office and you take a CD or a thumb drive or something, you can play maybe a half a dozen songs. If you can get them into your office and you can just click, click, click on the computer, you know, you can play maybe 15 or 20 songs. And they decide which ones they like. But more and more people just want you to send them that one song that you're really excited about. When I started, we were pitching songs on what is called reel-to-reel tape. Do you know what that is? Any of you know what that is? It's magnetic, what do you call it, magnetic tape on a spool. And between the songs, there is some white tape between the songs. So as you fast forward, and this is spinning from this spool over to this one, as you fast forward, you can see where the white tape is, so you can count, you know, when you're getting to song number 6 or 7. And so for me, to be able to go click, next song, click, next song. I mean, in those days when I started, I had 2 reel-to-reel tape recorders. And so I would be playing a song on this reel-to-reel, and as soon as I started, I'm over here queuing up the next one on this reel-to-reel, so I spin it forward to track number 5, if that's the song I want to pitch, and then when when that one finishes, or the artist or producer passes on it or whatever, then I move on to the next one. So I could play a few songs in a lot of time. Now I play a lot of songs in a little time. But in those days, I was pitching those songs, and as I was fast forwarding, I must have counted wrong, and I queued up the wrong song. And the artist is sitting here on the sofa, and I'm playing these songs, and I started playing that one, and then I started queuing up the next one. I thought, oh my gosh, that's not the song I meant to play. I would have never thought to pitch that to this artist. I looked over, and the artist was just sitting there grooving. Loved the song, and it was a #1 record. You'll notice I didn't even say the gender of the artist, let alone the name. And I never told the writers, there were 3 writers on it, but I was their hero for pitching their song and getting them a #1. They never knew it was a complete accident that I played it. So that's one way maybe the old technology helped the writer in that case because of my mistake. But I mean, how's the business changed? The technology's changed it all. There's fewer places to pitch songs. Albums don't sell. So you got to have a hit single. And back in now I wasn't involved in it in those days, but in the late 50s and 60s, in the early days of rock and roll and pop music, it was a singles business. They were on 45 RPM plastic discs called single records. And so we're back to pretty much a singles business. And if you don't have a pretty big hit single, there's just not any money in it. It's really not. I think she wants another question.
Absolutely.
I was gonna say, just with how different the industry is these days, what are some steps you recommend taking for, say, some of us that are just out of college who want to maybe get our foot in the door as far as
As a songwriter?
As a songwriter.
Boy, I don't have a ready answer for that. You just have to have the passion. You just have to be able to network yourself. You know, they still have live writers' nights at some places. Places where writers who are not really, you know, terribly advanced in their careers can still play. You can go to those places, and if you hear somebody and you think that would be a good match for a co-write, you know, you can network that way. And a lot of times, you know, if it's a writer who has a publishing deal, and if you can interest them in writing with you, they might take you into their company and introduce you. I don't want to get on too long a story, but I had a situation like that in the little big town music publishing days, where a writer brought in a song, and she came in because she was writing with one of my staff writers, so I got interested in her through that. And then this lady, who was a very meek, soft-spoken, not type A personality person, one day she brought me a cassette tape. You know what that is? She brought me this cassette tape of this writer, and so I listened to it probably when I was driving or something. I gave it back to her in a couple of days. It was a writer that she had encountered that she was impressed with, and said, I said, you know, I don't think I'm interested, thanks. And she said to me, and normally I would have expected her to say, okay, thanks for listening, I appreciate it. But what she said to me was, did you notice that that third song on there was a story song with no verbs? I said, no, I missed that. Let me listen again. So I went back and listened to the cassette again, really focused on it. And it turned out to be Jay Knowles, who is a co-writer of Odie's, and they've had some big success together. And I signed him. It was his very first publishing deal, and I signed him. And by the time the success really started for Jay was about the time that we had already sold Little Big Town Music to Sony. But anyway, he was writing wonderful songs, and as I say, they were writing together, and he's had some great successes and is still doing really well at it. So networking, you know, now with social networking, it's something I'm not real adept at, but I'm sure you are. And, you know, finding other writers and finding their songs on, you know, because everybody's got probably a SoundCloud link, you know, and you can go hear their songs. And it's just being very self-motivated and networking and taking advantage of opportunity. There's no easy answer, and there's no one answer for everybody. I don't know any two that have made it exactly the same way. So it's about dedication and passion and talent, and just keep pushing forward and moving forward and meeting more people until the right person is impressed with your music and wants to get serious talking about working with you. It's about the only way I know to answer that.
Just as a songwriter, like if you're not the best vocalist, but you're a good writer, when you're doing a demo, do you think that you should take the time and effort to find somebody that's like an excellent vocalist?
Absolutely. Yes, I think in a demo, even if it's just a guitar vocal demo, which can be fine, or a piano vocal, it needs to be well sung and played in tune on the instrument, and it just needs to be the best it can be in that format. But now there are, I could name, and I probably shouldn't say the names, but there are 2 or 3 incredibly successful writers who are not good singers, and they demand to sing, they insist on singing their own demos, but they've kind of got a style. I'll say one name, Craig Wiseman. Okay, Craig is not a great singer, but and honestly, you almost have to imagine the melody. Sometimes the way he presents it, you have to somehow kind of hear it in your head what he meant by that. It's not that it's out of tune, it's just he doesn't have a lot of range, and he sings and he doesn't hold notes, but there's just something special about the way he presents a song. But in general, my answer is get a good singer to sing it, and it should help your opportunities.
I want to say something to that. Craig Wiseman, you know, is a crazy successful songwriter, but he's also came along at a time where we don't have great singers on the radio that much. And I know from working with Jim Lauderdale, who is an incredible frickin' singer and melody guy, that his songs intimidate some singers. Not everybody can sing a Jim Lauderdale tune. So that may have worked to Craig's advantage. Was there another question?
I was plugging songs to Loretta Lynn one time, if you know who that is. This was in my Combine music days. And she listened to a demo and she just said, well, I just can't beat that vocal. And she didn't take the song. She said she really liked it. One other funny thing she said to me too, I played some song and she said this, she said, I love that song, but it ain't wrote right. She loved it, but it ain't wrote right. I don't even know what that meant. It was just funny. I just thought it was a funny.
I'd love to sit in a meeting and pitch songs to Loretta Lynn. That was awesome.
It was pretty fun.
Did you have a question, Hunter?
Mine's kind of the opposite question of his. As somebody who's prominently a singer and doesn't play an instrument or is a songwriter, how rare are those people, singers, songwriters that don't necessarily aren't proficient on an instrument?
20%. No, I don't know. I don't know how common that is. I do know that when people are seriously pursuing music, if they're writers and they don't play an instrument at all, I encourage them to learn enough to have instrumental accompaniment to their writing, but not everybody does, not everybody wants to. There are some people who are strictly lyricists, you know, that do pretty well. As an artist writer, I mean, if you have connected in some way as an artist and your career is starting a real artist trajectory, it's certainly easier to get with good co-writers who are great musically, and you can maybe be the main lyrical input. But just in general, writers who are strictly lyricists, you know, I can name a few, but it's better if you have some musical knowledge too. And I know writers who have input certainly into the melodies, even if they don't play an instrument. They write the lyrics in there with their co-writer. They can sing the melody they hear, you know, whether they can play it or not. So I think it's a benefit to be a musician as well as a singer, but it's not a requirement.
That's a good way to put it, but that's also why we've implemented the piano and guitar classes for songwriters here, so that we can get further down that road for folks that don't. I want to go back to, you said earlier about I think you mentioned Bob DePiro. You talked about writers that have had careers for many, many years. And I think that when you're at a young age, a college age, and you have that passion that you're talking about for music, that you love what you love, but you don't think about 30 years down the road. And the thing that impresses me about Bob, or it's just a difference, but say between Bob and Scotty, or John Scott Sherrill, Bob is somebody that's adapted with trends, whereas Scotty's more of this timeless writer that does his thing. Can you talk about the writers that have had long-term careers and what they've done to adapt and stay current, or how they went about that?
Part of what they probably tend to do in some cases is co-writing constantly with younger people who are more in touch with the culture of that time. You know, I mean, Braddock, I won't say his age, but he's older than I am, and that's pretty old. But I think he does co-write with some younger writers a good bit of the time. I know that Bob DePiro does. Tom Douglas is somewhat younger, and he and Tom Douglas just had a hit recently on Tim McGraw, the Southern Voice, a year or two ago, I guess. You know, they just, it's kind of like anybody in the culture. You know, people of a certain age, your parents, you may think your parents are totally out of touch with the culture, but you may know someone else their age who you feel like really knows what's going on, and they're aware of of what's happening within the culture, and they're pretty cool, you know? So it's just a matter of some people make an effort to stay up. Some people wallow in talking about the old days and how good things used to be, and they're not really looking forward. So I guess those writers that continue to have success for several decades, they're just continuing to look forward and working on the next song. They're not thinking about how great things used to be and how bad they are now. You know, a positive attitude, I guess, has a lot to do with that. Belief in self and positive attitude probably has a lot to do with staying current with the musical culture.
So some of these pro writers that have made a career out of it would be looking for young people to bring in fresh ideas.
Possibly.
Yeah, so that could be an opportunity
Mm-hmm.
for some young writers. Can we talk a little bit about that songwriting etiquette? And you know, it's we've heard the word in the past. They used to say "gerb," don't gerb me, or whatever. But just about.
Do you know where that word developed?
I don't.
I used to know and I've forgotten, but it was like a combination of something and germ. There was like two words.
Like groupie and germ.
Nah, it wasn't it, but something like that. It was two words, but I've forgotten now where that word came from. But etiquette really, there's something from the Bible called the Golden Rule, which says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I think if you put yourself in their position and picture someone like you coming at you, if you're a successful writer, again, I'm going to tell a little story here, a little personal story. It's from an earlier time, but I think the concept still applies. There was a writer, I was writing for this company, Combine Music, and hadn't had any success, and there was this writer that I really admired, and he was winning awards left and right, and I met him, and every time I saw him, I talked about him. I'd say, hey, congratulations on that new award, or man, I heard your new song on so-and-so. That's what a great record that turned out to be. What a cool song. Well, I talked about him. I didn't talk about me. I talked about him. And over a period of probably several months, at one point, he said, you're with Combine now, aren't you? And I said, yeah. And he said, we ought to get together sometime and see if we can come up with something. I mean, I just talked about him until he liked it a lot, I guess, and just felt like I was someone that he would like to get together with. Strange as it may sound, at that time, Combine Music didn't split copyrights with other companies, and I couldn't write with him for that reason. It was the last company that didn't split copyrights. You can't imagine that now. You know, this writer writes for this company, this writer writes for this company, let's get together, the company split the copyrights. It hadn't always been that way. But it meant a lot to me that he finally asked. So fast forward in today's culture, what do? I mean, you just try to be the kind of person that you would respond well to if you were on the other side. And I don't know everything that means, but it does mean if you get in their face and say, hey, I'm a student so-and-so, I studied under Odie Blackmon down at MTSU, and I write a lot, and I really like to get together, or I'd like you to listen to my songs. And you know, when you get so aggressive, people tend to put up a little bit of wall to kind of try to hold you back. So you just have to find that balance of being self-confident and still respecting their space, I guess, in a way is what I'm saying. But just keep coming back to that. Try to be the kind of person that you would like to see coming at you if you were in their position. That's the only thing, really the only way I know to say that.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? One thing I used to, I've told my students is that sometimes or I remember being young in the studios and the session players or other writers, they'd want to talk about anything but music. And I didn't get that. Like in my early 20s, I was like, man, these guys must not even like music. But what I realized is that they were working in it all the time. You know, when you've gotten to that point in your career, you've put in your 10,000 hours or whatever, and they're still deep into it, but they like to have a well-rounded life. And so sometimes it's nice to talk about other things.
About family and personal things. I mean, when I see other people in the business, I often say, how's your family? And I usually know the names of the family. I'm pretty good on remembering names. And that's something that it just occurred to me that you might mention too, if you see John Grady, the head of IRS Nashville Records, you might say, how's Susie doing? Has she recovered from that illness back in December? I mean, know something about the people that you're interfacing with that will give you a place to have a conversation. If there's some writer, there's so much, just on Wikipedia, but all over social media, there's so much information available that if there's someone you want to connect with, you can find probably something in common to ask them about. Oh, I understand you love to do bicycling. I do some cycling myself, and I think that's pretty cool. Anything, any common connection point.
I just wanted to add to that. I feel like that's kind of cultural, or like depending on your environment or whatnot. Because I know I was at an industry summit once before, and I was meeting T.I. as manager. And when I came with that pitch that you're speaking of right now, it's about this and that. Outside of the music, he was like, hey man, let's go. What do you want? Like, I gotta talk to other people.
Yeah.
So I guess it really kind of depends on, sometimes the people moving faster. Some people talk to me, what do you want? Like, be sensitive to me.
The situation, and having something in common to talk about. But if it's after a show and people are lined up for autographs and stuff, you can't engage in conversation at that time, So that's true. I mean, you would have to, again, just being sensitive to the other person and survey the situation. And
That's picking the right time.
Yeah.
But at an industry conference like you were at,
Yeah.
but I will say that you mentioned John Grady, and I don't know if you know this, but you know how we became pals? It wasn't through the music business. A friend from Arkansas brought Grady a hive of bees, and he didn't know what to do, and he was asking Mark Brand, he said, do you know anybody with bees? And Mark said, yeah, Odie. So I get a call from Grady, he's like, can you help me with my beehives? And that's how we became buds,
That's good.
but now I got a cut on this artist, new record, so you never know
you never
how
do.
you guys are gonna, connect.
And I know when Garth Brooks was singing demos for me back in I guess that would have been in the 80s, had one writer in particular that used Garth quite a bit. And we used his now wife, Trisha Yearwood, as well. But a lot of people started out singing demos. I had Alan Jackson sing a few demos. Then I had to replace him with Verlin Thompson so they'd be in tune. But that's another story. But Garth sang demos for this one particular writer, and so Garth would say to this writer, man, we ought to get together sometime and write. My writer would say, well, I'm pretty busy right now, but yeah, we'll get together sometime, but I'm booked up for right now. As soon as Garth got his record deal and hit the charts, this writer started chasing him, and he did not get a call back. And he's never written with Garth. But, if you see artists coming along that you believe in, I mean, my writers are working with new artists all the time, and hopefully some of them will make it. They certainly will not all make it, but if you find somebody that you really believe in, that you think, and they're still just starting, and you still can connect with them, that can be a good thing to do.
Mm-hmm. I was telling my students today, I was telling them about this new Striking Matches cut. I guess I wrote 25 to 30 songs with them to get one cut on the record.
Wow.
Yeah. And because it's so competitive out there.
Mm-hmm.
Say if the artist your writers are working with, a new artist that gets a publishing deal, how much art do you think they're writing? I mean, are they writing twice a day with people, or what's the pace like, I guess?
Probably not twice a day, probably one writing session a day, I would guess, and in the successful ones, they do get a song. I mean, the professional writers usually go in the room expecting to get a song that day, not expecting to start a song and then tweak it some and get back together and decide if it's a different direction. I mean, the really professional writers expect to get a song that day, and most of them do. But I think it's usually for writers and artist writers, it's probably like one session a day, I think, you know?
But the pace is, you get 3 or 4 hours to get a hit song. So there's a lot of prep work.
The pace is, you start about 11 o'clock, you get a verse and a chorus, you go to lunch, you come back, get another verse, maybe a bridge, you go home about 3 or 4. It's a terrible life. Rough life.
But nowadays we have Jimmy John, so we don't even have to go to lunch.
That's right.
We could just eat through.
They're coming into my building several times a day.
We're fast. All right, you guys, what other questions you have? We've got this experienced, seasoned professional here. Any other questions? Okay. T?
I guess if you're not necessarily a person that's in like a country genre, would you say that you should be, hesitant to send music to, publishers that do country music? I mean, 'cause if you write good music, it'll be identified as good music, period, right?
Well, yeah, it can be identified as good music, period, but my company is small, and when people say, what kind of music do you publish, I say country music, because I don't really try to get involved in pitching for film and TV or pop, but coming out of Nashville, you see Meghan Trainor, you see the Black Keys, you see Jack White, there's a lot of pop and rock music coming from Nashville, but it's not from my company.
Because I was meaning we looked at in class, we looked at a couple of examples of for Dolly Parton and Whitney Houston, things that can have interpretations in different genres. If you're pitching music, do you think that the publishers will be able to see that this can be used in a different genre? Or is it that you have to pitch it in that genre?
The publisher might see it, but it doesn't mean they're in a position to make it happen. You need to focus on, if my target is getting a, just trying to think of a good example of a pop artist, but you got a pop artist, you kind of look at where they're getting their music, who the co-writers are, who the companies are that are involved in that, and maybe trying to approach that path. Instead of just going to a hillbilly publisher, which I pretty much describe myself as, and say, I've got a song that would be great for Katy Perry, can you help me out? No, I can't. Jay-Z, can't help you, but, so you just have to kind of do some studying of the market, and don't just go to anybody and assume they have access to the whole world of artists and musical styles. You can see what other activity that company has had, and where you kind of get an idea of where their connections are, where they have connections where they can actually get music heard. Big Yellow Dog Music publishes Meghan Trainor. Now that she has hit so big in pop, they may be in a position, through the connections they've made with that career, with the record label and so forth. L.A. Reid's label, I think is what she's
That's
on.
who signed her.
What is it?
I don't know what
The label, oh my gosh. It's a famous corporate label. But anyway, I'm sure they've made certain connections through navigating the waters of that pop act and that pop deal and all of the success of that, where they can go to those people again with another artist possibly. So look at things like that. Who are these people connected with? Who's connected with the path that I want to go to get to a certain artist? All I know to say about that.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
For guys like Tony Joe White that wrote a lot of his own songs, but also had other people record his own songs, like Will and Jim's doing Willie and Laura Mae Jones. Is he involved in a co-publishing deal, or is it more a songwriter agreement? Since he's having other people record his own songs, so he's also recording his own material as well.
Yeah, right now, I'm sure anything Tony Joe writes is probably just published by him, and he probably has someone administering the publishing for his catalog. In those days, I imagine when he first came to Combine, it was probably 100% published by Combine. As he had success, I'm sure he or his attorney, these days it would certainly be an attorney, would negotiate a co-publishing deal. When the contract is up for renewal, the artist or their representative would go to the publisher and say, look, we've had this much success. I'd like to stay here, but this company over here is offering me co-pub and a pretty big advance, and, so then you get into a negotiation like that. I was trying to think, was it Silver Fox? I was trying to think what Tony Joe's publishing name was, but he certainly had co-publishing with Combine Music before that relationship ended. When I was a college student, this was before my advertising career, before my Army, I was still a college student here. Combine was a very young company, and I was actually pitching songs there, taking songs. Somebody introduced me to the head guy, and so I would, from MTSU, I would go and play him songs. And one time I was sitting there, and he said, "Man, I just found a white Ray Charles." He said, "This guy came into my office last week, and I think Tony Joe in that first visit brought his songs, the two that turned out to be such huge early hits." And so the guy took one of my songs that I really wanted to be recorded by Joe Tex, who was a big rhythm and blues artist at that time, and he played it for Tony Joe. Tony Joe recorded it on his very first album. It did not make the album. 2 years ago, I discovered that my song was on a box set of the complete Tony Joe White recordings put out by one of the reissue record labels, author unknown. And so I did wind up contacting the label. I now have full publishing and writer rights and being paid for it. But it was interesting, and my son said, "That's pretty cool, Dad. Your first cut may also wind up being your last cut." So anyway.
I've got one other question for you that, looking towards the future of the music business.
Is there one?
Well, that's my question, and it's interesting how many people are singing the blues about collecting royalties, about getting paid on songs, and yet we're seeing all of this outside money come into town, buying up catalog as fast as they can right now. And I know it's a buyer's market, but do you have any insight on that? Because obviously these people, these are, smart investors, they must see something down the line.
People in the music business for decades have really felt that the long-term value is in copyright. Paul McCartney bought the Buddy Holly catalog. He was a big artist in the late 50s. He advised Michael Jackson that buying copyrights was really the way to go. Michael bought the Beatles catalog. Paul was a little sorry that he informed Michael about that, but he beat out McCartney in actually buying the Beatles publishing catalog. But so yeah, I think the long-term value is in copyright. I think that the future will be bright. When we started Little Big Town Music in 1986 or 87, I guess, the country music business was just in the tank. The music had gotten so predictable, and there was actually an article in the Wall Street Journal that declared the country music business was just over. The music had gotten so pop and so orchestrated, and artists like Olivia Newton-John, Kenny Rogers, John Denver, a lot of pop artists were doing country music, and it just wasn't country and it wasn't interesting. But then Randy Travis came out with an album called Storms of Life, and everything changed. It went back to very traditional country music. It led up to what we call the class of '89. That was in about '87. In 1989 came forth Garth Brooks, Alan Jackson, Clint Black, and Travis Tritt. They call that the class of '89. And on through the '90s, country music was booming for other reasons I mentioned earlier. So when it does seem really dark, there will be light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully it'll be a bright light. Yes, streaming royalties are very low, and streaming is the way music is acquired these days. So downloading is, it's on its way out. There's still certainly some legal paid iTunes type, downloading, but, streaming is where it is. But there's a lot of efforts to get legislation to change royalty rates. and to try to make it make sense. The Nashville Songwriters Association is very involved in all that lobbying. There are a lot of entities that have a lot of ideas. The music business will be saved, and it will be saved by your generation, because the music business is usually saved by an innovation usually comes from young people who are just having fun maybe and trying to, you probably know the story of how like Facebook started to meet chicks, you know? So, I mean, innovation will come about not by people who are thinking, I need to come up with a solution so I can make a lot of money and create an app that I can sell for $1 billion. It's just going to come from people who are looking for a better way and a more sensible way to do things, in some cases probably accidentally, without even thinking I'm going to change the industry or change the world. But there will be innovation that makes it profitable to write songs and have activity with songs. I don't know what that is, and nobody ever knows what it is until after the fact, and hindsight is 20/20, and you see, oh my gosh, we should have embraced digital impact on music in the year 2000, when I think that's when the MP3 was invented. We fought it for years, thinking it would go away. Technology is always way ahead of legislation. So technology is always going to be on the front end, and we just try to catch up and try to find ways to deal with it and monetize it, and you guys will make it happen.
Y'all, let's thank Woody Bomar for coming today.